Hallo en welkom by vanaand se uitsending. 'n Volgepropte uur lê voor.
Waar staan sake met oud-president Jacob Zuma se hofgedinge? En hoe vorder die regstryd oor die geldigheid van die parlementêre proses oor grondonteiening?
Ons wil ook weet hoe die ANC voor die Zondo-kommissie die week gevaar. En dit was 'n aaklige dag vir Eskom. Sy halfjaar uitslaa en 'n parlementêre verslag maak vir donker leeswerk.
Laat ons wegspring regstreeks soos elke week hier vanuit die ateljee in Johannesburg.
Rob Rose is die redakteur van die Financial Mail en daar het pas 'n indrukwekkende boek oor die Steinhoff-skandaal uit sy pen verskyn. Steinheist vertel die verhaal van Marcus Jooste en wat Suid-Afrika se grootste korporatiewe bedrogspel genoem word. Rob, welcome to the program.
Thanks.
In the book you make the point that there were warning signs, and if we look back now, some of it seemed obvious. But why were those signs ignored?
Well, I think, in any corporate situation, there are a whole lot of guys who will say, the end is coming, and people think, well, it's not really coming. I think Christo Wiese was specifically warned a couple of times in 2009 by various analysts that, this is not the kind of share to invest in, and yet he still went ahead and put a lot of money into it. And I think that there's a certain situation where you don't want to hear the truth, I suppose, and you don't want to believe that this fantastic story you've heard from someone is not true. There were certain warning signs all over the place. There was the fact that Marcus Jooste had a giant tax case against him for 200 million rand in 2011. This is 7 years before it collapsed, and people just didn't hear the warning signs.
I'm fascinated by this character, Marcus Jooste. Heard of him before the scandal, and he was a bit of the wolf of Dorp Street. But what a remarkable person. I never met him. For people to follow him and believe him, and now what we know about him is a completely different picture. Just give us a little picture of who is this guy? Does he have personal charisma? Is he extraordinarily clever?
I spoke to a lot of people who went to school with him in university, and they talk of, how there was a cult around this guy, that he was super smart, he was very charismatic, like you said, and he could spin a really good yarn about a certain trajectory. And the fact is that people, the entire board of Steinhoff seems to have just thought, well, Marcus has got it sorted, so we don't need to do anything about it. People followed him, and there seems to be a certain degree of narcissism and various other issues in terms of his own personal trajectory that led to what happened. When something goes wrong, I spoke to a couple of psychologists and various people who look at what happens in these white-collar crimes. It's the moment when something goes wrong, what do you do then? Do you fess up and say, I messed up and let's fix it? Or do you try and cover your tracks? And that's the moment where things twist and turn. And that's the same thing that happened for Bernie Madoff. In the Madoff scandal, it's that moment when he could have said, actually, I've lost all your money, but he didn't. He tried to cover it up. And I think that moment for Marcus was a couple of years ago, and he just took the wrong option at the time. And then from then on, you're basically covering your tracks for years. And there's so many psychological aspects that go into that. I think there's...
But even a formidable businessman like Christo Wiese believed the guy almost right to the end.
No, Christo Wiese was completely taken in by Marcus Jooste. I think that's why he feels so wounded by him. Initially he would always talk about Marcus, and now he just refers to him as Jooste if you speak to Christo, which is it's a fascinating shift.
You talk about this trust and loyalty and how they struck deals just by a handshake. But what does this say about corporate culture in South African companies? Is Steinhoff the rule, or is that the exception? Is this how companies are run?
I think there are a lot of companies that are run like this. I think it's very unicellular. People tell me, the new chairwoman, Heather Son, said to me that one of the issues at Steinhoff is that every single person, including the investor relations person, the media person, was a chartered accountant. It was traditionally sort of white male chartered accountants. And it's a very unicellular...
Sort of groupthink.
Yeah, exactly, groupthink. And people didn't question the guy enough, and there was not enough skepticism on the board. And certainly the auditors could have been more skeptical.
But what were some of those tricks? What did he do? How did he manage to pull the wool over their eyes to that extent?
Well, this guy's very smart. He was one of the smartest guys.
Was the smartest guy in the room?
One of the myths around was that he got the highest marks in the board exam for his year. It's a myth I think he cultivated, but it was one that really captured the minds of people in Steinhoff. But for example, they had, instead of having one auditor, Deloitte, that looked at all the operations across the world, they had small little audit firms no one's heard of in Europe, where a lot of the fraud happened. And the small audit firm would take the results and give it to Deloitte, and Deloitte wouldn't go back and check what happened there. So it was things like that. And when the chief financial officer Ben Lagrange said, actually, we need one auditor to look at all this. Marcus said, let's not do that because these small auditors, they understand the language, they understand the culture. So small things like that happened along the way, which could have made a big difference, I suppose, when you look at it in retrospect.
A lot of business people in South Africa really resent him, even the ones who didn't lose money, because this came just on the top of the whole hysteria about white monopoly capital.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it sort of strengthened that argument considerably. Is that true?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it came at a terrible time. It came after KPMG. It came after trust in all our institutions were being deeply hammered. And we saw that in the World Economic Forum rankings before. We were considered amongst the top 3 in the world for auditing standards, for governance. And yet things like this all of a sudden happened, and suddenly we've plummeted down those rankings. And it was a crisis of capitalism, of governance, and it fed into it. It also exposed the myth that the corporate sector is just miles better in terms of governance than the political sector. And I think that has made a lot of people quite skittish in terms of all companies, and it hasn't helped our investment reputation globally, I don't think.
Do we have the capacity and the skills and the knowledge in the serious Special Investigations Unit and the Hawks and the NPA to actually get through to this guy and bring him to justice?
I have serious doubts about that.
Is it a case of the smartest guys would rather go to the corporate sector? I mean, they'd rather go to the money. How do you keep those guys
I think so.
in the public sector?
There's also been, a lot of people, like certainly is that a lot of people were working in these government institutions as a form of service to society. But when those institutions became corrupted and it did not become a valuable thing, or a thing that made sense to them, they left and went to the private sector. They went to forensic companies. And the problem, I think, with Steinhoff is that the guy leading the investigation is the same man who was leading the Preez investigation, who Popo Molefe, the chairman, had actually went to court to try and force him to do his job. So this is the man leading the Steinhoff investigation at the Hawks, and it's lamentable. I mean, the guys in Tygon, this company that collapsed in 2002, the CEO is still not in jail, still hasn't even had his trial. So the odds of bringing this to trial it's vanishingly slim. I'd like to believe it's going to happen, but depends, I suppose, on the NPA announcement in the next 2 weeks.
Is proper regulation or improvement in the way we regulate these companies, is that going to make a difference? You quote Nikki Newton-King, the JSE CEO, says, we're always going to have fraudsters. We just have to accept this.
Yeah, I think it also depends on the way you look at companies. There was that complacency that we were so good at governance and that we needn't do too much. But I think boards need to be more sceptical of what people tell them. And certainly they weren't in this case. I think it's a big wake-up call to people that this kind of thing can happen, and it's quite alarming that you speak to all of Marcus's former colleagues and friends, and they're shocked by this. There's a deep sense of betrayal because so much trust was involved in this, as opposed to looking at it and saying, let's be skeptical of what this person. Let's ask, trust but verify. I think is the rule that a lot of directors would live by, and I think that was deeply shattered in this case, and it's going to have deep repercussions for the corporate sector for a long time. I think in other companies.
Rob, everybody who's read it said brilliant book, so congratulations.
Well, Max, if it's only half as good as yours.
Thank you. Bly geskakel, ons is net hierna terug, dan gesels ons Eskom.